Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Cenarius on Mythic in the Emerald Nightmare.
Yes, so congratulations, you finally made it to the hardest boss in the instance, and once you've killed this guy, well, you're just plain sailing. But this encounter is difficult. It's not a complete pushover, and does require quite a lot of progression to get through the entire thing, which is kind of surprising because the actual strategies you use for the encounter are kind of similar to what you did on Heroic. The biggest difference on Mythic is that the mobs that you decided to cleanse will actually turn evil when the next set of adds are summoned. So as an example, if you cleanse the wisps on the first wave, they'll then become evil when the second wave spawns. Another big difference on Mythic is that the wave of adds that spawn have significantly higher health than they did on Heroic. As a result, it takes far longer to kill them, which means there's far less damage going out onto Cenarius. If you tank all the mobs away from the boss out of form range, which you most likely did on Heroic, it's not uncommon that you'll see 4 or even 5 ad waves, and guilds that have low DPS may even see 6. And while tanking these mobs away from Cenarius out of form range definitely seems like a safer way to play out the encounter, you know, by taking it slow and not taking unnecessary damage, it's actually not a good idea to do that. It actually punishes your raid if you do end up seeing the 4th, 5th or 6th wave. It's just way more progression to do, and the idea is that you just nuke down Cenarius and get him into phase 3 as soon as you possibly can. So instead, on certain waves, it's much better for you to tank all the mobs under Cenarius so you can constantly cleave. This does mean that your raid will take almost constant Thorns damage, which does put a lot of pressure on your healers, but it isn't unhealable at all. And as a result, the boss will transition a lot earlier, which makes the fight a lot shorter, which means the healers can be a little bit more reckless with their mana. But as I said, you don't do this on every single wave, such as when you have the double sisters, we deliberately don't tank them on top of Cenarius. It's far too messy, and we'll talk about all these individual situations in a moment. And the adds have also had some enhancements to their abilities. These changes don't necessarily affect the encounter too much, but you need to take them into account while fighting against them just to make sure things are done correctly. And again, we'll get to these when we talk about each ad individually.
Now the most important thing to note is that you do not need to kill a single Drake in this entire encounter. If you have your best geared tank pick up the dragons and take them right in the corner, away from everyone else, the raid can completely ignore them. All they do is just pick a random player to breath towards, which can be outranged by the entire group, and then they just melee hit the tank. As long as they're not dropped below 50% health, they're virtually harmless to your raid. Now which tank you use isn't overly important, just make sure it's the most geared one. The dragons do hurt on a single player just with their melee hit, especially if you manage to get 4 of them. Typically you'll only be dealing with 2, but even so they still hurt. You'll also need a healer sat in the corner to keep your tank up. It's incredibly important that this healer is either a paladin or a monk. Paladins and monks will never be targeted by the roots because the roots consider them as melee players. If you can choose between both of those classes, then definitely go paladin. They are the best healer for this situation by a mile, just because they're ridiculously good at tank healing, and with Rule of Law they can even heal the raid when they're really far away from them. This strat will require you to bring a 3rd tank, as Cenarius now has a tank switch mechanic on Mythic, which requires 2 tanks to deal with it, and switching Cenarius for multiple Drakes at once will be a huge pain in the arse to deal with, not only for your tanks who are trying to pick up Drakes and Cenarius and try and switch them about, but also for your raid while they're trying to attack Cenarius while avoiding the Drake's breath.
Now before we talk about the fight as a whole, let's lastly talk about brambles. So the brambles are very lethal on Mythic, just like they are on Heroic. Not only do they do a crazy amount of damage to anyone that's caught by them, but they also prevent that player who is now rooted from positioning correctly, which again could also kill them. At no point should you ever get caught by the roots. Instead, you should always be aware of where they are and who they're going towards. And although this sounds really fucking stupid, it's important that you know the way that you deal with the brambles is by using your eyes. As soon as the roots spawn, you need to try and gauge exactly who it's fixating on so that person can kite it away and everyone else can move away from that player. So there's a few simple steps. Move away from the roots when they spawn, look at where it's going, and if it's on you, kite it away from busy areas. There are areas of the room that you want to keep clear of roots at different points of the fight, and we'll explain those in a moment. And you need to have a plan in your mind how you would try and avoid those areas if the roots fixate you. And then of course, everyone then needs to be ready for the refixate. Each bramble will change its fixate target at least once throughout its duration. This means that you will always need to know where it is and be ready to repeat what you did when it spawns. Move away from it, work out who it's on, kite away from the busy areas. And if you do this throughout the entire fight, that will really minimize the amount of problems that you have with brambles. And if you take anything away from this video before you actually go and pull the boss, don't be shit with brambles. 50% of your progression is literally don't be shit with brambles. If you can do that from the very start, it will make progressing this boss a lot easier for everyone. Now, because you have Drakes alive in the corner of the room with a tank for the entire fight, you're a little bit limited in where you can exactly kite the brambles, and as a result, you're going to need to clear them pretty frequently. So you want your rogues to use cloak, your hunters to use turtle, your shadow priests to disperse, paladins can bubble. Any class that has a high damage reduction, you can throw Blessing of Freedom on them and they can run through it. And the idea is that you just clear it up pretty much every single time brambles spawn. But you need to make sure that you assign this or call it on the fly and make sure that 2 players don't do it at the exact same time, because they can easily waste cooldowns. Now, if you're lacking any of these cooldowns, but you have maybe an excess of rogues, make your rogues go outlaw. Their damage might be less because maybe they haven't worked on their artifact or some shit like that. But if you do roll the bones into the CDR buff, this will help reduce the cooldown on cloak, allowing them to clear way more often. And rogues, if you combine cloak with grappling hook, it's absolutely insane how much room you can clear in a very short space of time. And with all of that out of the way, and again before we go on the next section, don't be shit with fucking brambles. Let's go throughout the fight, stage by stage, and show the strategies and positioning required in order to kill the encounter.
Now on the pool, you want to Bloodlust and drag Cenarius over to the Wisps and nuke the hell out of him. Healers, you should be pre-potting just to deal some extra damage as well. Tanks, you're going to want to face Cenarius away from the group due to his new ability, which is Nightmare Blast. He will send out a 30-yard long beam targeted towards the tank. This will do a high amount of burst damage to anyone hit, and also apply a debuff causing them to take 100% more damage from the beam for 45 seconds. You want the 2 non-Drake tanks to taunt on 2, and for the second application you want to make sure you use some sort of cooldown, as it will be hitting you much harder than the first. Now when the thorns come in for the first time, keep attacking the boss. You're going to be attacking all the way through these thorns. You want to be cleansing the wisps, resetting your stacks, and then have the range spread lightly for the incoming roots. At this point, a drake and a tree will spawn. You want your 3rd tank to go and pick up the drake and tank it in the corner of the room where it spawned, and have your assigned healer go over with them and just sit there for the rest of the fight, healing a tank and dancing around breath. You then want your 2nd tank to taunt the tree over and tank it underneath the boss. The DPS then want to switch to it and kill it off, whilst cleaving as much damage as possible onto Cenarius. At this point, the raid will be taking a fair amount of damage through the thorns because they're hitting 2 targets and they've still probably got cooldowns and Bloodlust up. You really want to try and avoid using healing cooldowns. Instead, you want to be using AoE heals and then spot healing certain classes that are very, very bursty, such as fire mages. If they have the legendary braces, can nearly one-shot themselves. So make sure you just keep an eye on the targets that are taking a lot of damage and just spot heal them while trying not to use any of your cooldowns. You then want to get ready to stack up underneath the tree for its stomp. However, you first need to identify who has the roots. The player that has got the roots needs to start kiting them away from the group, as it is likely that it will refixate during the stomps, and if the roots go into melee during that time, it is very likely that you'll lose a player or 2. Everyone apart from the root player, and of course the tank and the healer with the drake, should then stack up under the tree for the stomp. On Mythic, the change to the tree is that it will always do 2 stomps in a row, with the 2nd stomp dealing more damage than the first, as you get a debuff from the first that increases the damage you take from the 2nd. At this point, we use a Spirit Link and a Tranquility. Spirit Link at this point is amazing, not only to equalize the amount of damage people are taking from the thorns. If someone's doing a lot of bursty damage, then it's just spread across everyone. But on top of that, if someone accidentally doesn't get hit by the stomp, but they're within the Spirit Link itself, they still help share the damage of it. As soon as the 2nd stomp has gone off, have all the range re-spread out around the boss and keep kiting the roots around. You then want to kill off the tree while clearing away some of the brambles, and you also want to reset your stacks by using up any of the wisp patches that are left on the ground. Now going into wave 2, ideally before the 2nd wave of ad spawn, you want Cenarius around the 60% mark, and you want all players to reset their stacks either on the initial green pool or the pool from the wisps. This is because all of those pools are about to deactivate, and you won't have much of an opportunity to reset your stacks again for around 15 to 25 stacks worth of time. The Drake tank will also want to reset their stacks on a green wisp pool. You want to make sure that you time your reset so it's just after a breath happens, just so you can go and reset your stacks without having to worry about the breath going off in the middle of the room and potentially catching out some of the other people in the raid. Now you also want to have Cenarius, the tank and the melee DPS stick on the new wisp tree in order to cleanse it, while the range DPS and the off tank get ready to kill off the old set of wisps. As soon as Cenarius casts his Force of Nature, the 5 patches of green grass from the previous nice wisps will now spawn 1 evil wisp each. These wisps will still chase after the target with the highest threat, explode on them dealing damage to them and anyone nearby, whilst resetting their threat in the process. However, on Mythic, when the wisps die, they'll do a large burst of damage to the raid. As an example, if you were to explode all 5 at once, you will very likely get one shot. So instead, you just need to kill the wisps in a staggered out fashion. We always kill 3 in one chunk with a set of cooldowns, and then kill the other 2 off one by one after the raid is topped off. The set of cooldowns that you want to use when these wisps explode is entirely up to you because it does depend on your composition, but generally speaking, unless you have a shaman use absolutely everything, you want to use 2 big major output or defensive cooldowns just to cover the wisps explosions. Now you can pre-select what wisps you want to kill as they will always spawn from the green patches before, so this allows you to MD all of those wisps to the tank, CC and stun them from there, and then you can finish them off nice and quickly before moving on to the adds that you actually need to deal with. Now as you're cleansing the wisps again, you will have 1 sister and 1 more drake. You want the drake tank to pick up the drake, he happens to be in that corner anyway, so it can very easily pick it up and just keep him in the corner. The sister on Mythic is much more deadly than it was on Heroic. On top of the dot that is randomly applied to players, you'll also need to interrupt the heal much more often. This usually requires an interrupt rotation, so make sure you assign 2 or 3 players to cover the interrupts before the fight even begins. However, the most dangerous ability from the sisters is definitely the Scorn Touch. This is applied to many more players in comparison to Heroic and slows you by 75% rather than 60%. Because of this, you need to be pre-spread out, so when the debuff is applied to you, you don't need to move at all, or you just need to move very, very little to make sure that the debuff won't keep spreading throughout the raid. This can be tough for melee, so as a rule of thumb, we have pre-assigned directions for melee DPS to run to whenever the Scorn Touch comes in, because otherwise it can very easily bounce around in melee forever. Now if you have any wisps up at this point, try not to combo their death with an explosion of Scorn Touch. It'll make your healers hate you a lot more, but you do need to eventually kill off the wisps as soon as the raid is topped, cleave them all down, nuke down the sister whilst of course still maintaining some DPS on Cenarius. Healers do need to pay extra attention to multi-dotting classes because they will be taking that extra damage from the Dreadroot's reflection. Now with bramble placements during this wave of adds, there are generally not that many areas that are strictly off limits. Just make sure you don't take it into melee and make sure that it's cleaned up frequently. Once the sister is dead, switch back to Cenarius and get ready for arguably the hardest part of the fight.
Going into this next wave, you want to have Cenarius around the 47% mark, and you want to move him over towards the tree. The reason for this is that this next wave consists of 1 tree and 2 sisters. And it's also very, very important that going into this wave that everyone resets their stack from either the wisps or the old green patch before this wave even comes in. And the reason why it's so vital is of course you no longer have the green patches from the wisps during this wave. Now you want to cleanse the tree, which means you're going to have 2 sisters up, and almost every single player is going to have a Scorn Touch at some point, which means everyone needs to be spread out. Now as soon as the old wisps become active, the evil ones, again you'll want to kill 3 of them off as soon as you possibly can, and then kill the last 2 once the raid is topped up. This is when you want to use your next set of healing cooldowns. Keep in mind that the first CDs from the first set of wisps won't be up, but if you decided to use a Tranquility on the first stomp, that will be up for this one. And because the raid is so spread at this point as well, AoE healing doesn't become as effective. This is the best time to be using a personal cooldown as well. We even use health pots as a form of cooldown at this point, just to give that little bit of help to the healers. The melee DPS and the tank want to make sure that the tree is cleansed, while everyone else is pre-spread, ready to fight the sisters. You want to mark one of them down and focus all your damage into it, using your second pots and your cooldowns to finish it off as soon as possible, just to reduce the overall damage that is incoming from the Scorn Touches. Now with the brambles in this phase, you really want to make sure that they do not go anywhere near the tree. The healers at this point, you really want to make the most of the tree standing underneath it, because you're not really going to have another opportunity to get your mana back. And because the damage is so high at this point, if you can just be really reckless with your mana and just spam heal people, if you can do this while under the tree, there's absolutely no reason why not to. You'll get the majority of that mana back. So anyone that is fixated by the brambles, try your best not to kite them under the tree. And if they do go under the tree, you want to clear them as soon as you possibly can. Now after the double sisters are dead, you'll then want your players with the high stacks to use the green pool from the tree's initial spawn. This pool isn't big enough for everyone to reset their stacks, so you may want to prioritize classes that don't have any damage reductions available or any form of passive self-healing. And at this point, really you need to make a decision, and it completely depends on how much damage you've done to the boss. If you can transition the boss to phase 2, which happens at 35% health before the next wave spawns, then you definitely want to do it. It will allow you to go into the last phase with only 2 drakes up, and allows phase 2 to be generally a lot cleaner. This means that your Shadow Priests need to pop Surrender to Madness early just so you can enter this phase early, then you should. Phase 2 isn't particularly difficult, and dropping 1 or 2 Shadow Priests midway into that phase definitely isn't the end of the world. And if you're slightly off that percentage and you can't push the boss before the 4th wave, you should really look at trying to maximize your damage in some way so you can get to that point. But ultimately, if you keep trying and you just cannot do it, you're forced to deal with a 4th wave.
And the 4th wave consists of 2 drakes and 1 set of wisps. We recommend that you cleanse the wisp, which allows you to drop your stacks more often, but it does mean that the drake tank will be tanking 4 of them rather than 2 of them in phase 2. Also, you're going to need to kill off the tree that has now become evil. We recommend that if you are super behind on boss damage, that you actually tank it underneath the boss and just cleave it down carefully. This allows you to maximize your boss damage whilst getting rid of the ad, and it makes a nice little focal point for you to stack up for the stomp. Of course, you do not have to tank it under Cenarius, and you may not want to if you're about to transition, as the tree really needs to be dead before Cenarius hits 35% health. Once again, you want to kind of do what you did in phase 1, where you kite the brambles away from melee and get the raid to stack up underneath the tree in order to help spread the damage of the stomp. Now, once you're about to transition, make sure you reset your stacks and then you get ready for phase 2. Now, phase 2 is all to do with positioning. However, let's very quickly go over the new abilities the boss will be gaining. The ads will no longer spawn in phase 2, and he will no longer have the Nightmare Blast ability. Instead, the tanks will be having to deal with the Spear of Nightmare. You want to have the tanks taunt off one another and have CDs lined up to reduce the damage taken, which of course reduces the size of the pool that spawns. Do note, because of a recent hotfix, you can now bop it and make the circle absolutely tiny. Just make sure that you have a bop applied to you during the cast, not before. Otherwise, you'll just cast the Spear of Nightmare on someone else. Now, in this phase, the brambles will also be coming in much more frequently, and it is important that you clear them as much as possible. Just continue to kite them and just don't bring them into melee and don't get caught out. Now, a new mechanic for you to deal with during this phase is Beasts of Nightmare. 2 walls of beasts will spawn on the edges of the room and move across the encounter area in one set direction. If you're hit by this wall, you just simply take a shit ton of damage. However, you're not knocked up by them or anything, you can pass through it. So assuming that you can survive the damage, run through the wall if you're going to get caught out. Otherwise you'll be hit by it multiple times. Otherwise, it is very important that you identify where the wall is and quickly sidestep it. This can suck quite a lot for the melee and the tanks, as the wall can spawn on top of you. You just have to react quickly and move out of its way. You also have Malfurion getting rooted, which is preventing him from spawning the green pool of goo on the ground. We destroy the roots on him only once, as by the time he would cast his nice green pool of goo on the ground, the boss is kind of close to death anyway. However, if this phase is going to last a long time for you, make sure you release Malfurion multiple times.
And with that out of the way, let's talk about the positioning in the last phase very, very briefly. So, of course, you have your Drake tank on the opposite side of the room, right in the corner, and you have Cenarius in a corner. Now, as the spears come in and the patches start to grow, it's very, very important that, of course, you do move Cenarius out of the way, because you can't have the raid stood inside these patches that are growing. But as a result, you're getting closer and closer towards the drakes, and it will get to the point where the drakes are so close that you're eating their breath. So as a result, the tank that's tanking the drakes needs to completely mirror the movement of Cenarius, making sure that there is always the largest gap between the raid and the drakes. And that's pretty much all you need to do. But do keep in mind, as a tank on the drakes and the healers that are healing you up, your stacks are going up and up and up. You don't get the opportunity to reset them in the raid like everyone else does. As a result, you really want to start saving personal cooldowns towards the end of the encounter, where you're getting absolutely battered. In our very first kill, we actually resorted to having a second healer to come over to help keep the tank up, because as the stacks start to hit around 100, it is very, very deadly, especially when you have 4 drakes on you. But apart from that, if you can deal with that little scenario, and you manage to clear the roots in the last phase, and you can deal with the spear, as well as the wall, this last phase is actually relatively easy to deal with. It's just all about the first phase and all the different ad waves. And again, if you can take anything away with you from this video, it's brambles. Don't get caught by brambles.
You're gonna die. Thank you very much for watching, and before you go, do check out our sponsored Discord. Discord is a service where you can make a server for your friends or your guild with voice comms and text channels entirely for free. We have our own community Discord server where we talk about raiding and talking about brambles and our videos, or just generally chilling out with you lot. We're on there quite a lot at the moment, so do come check it out. The link is in the description below. And we'd also like to say a big thank you to our supporters on Patreon for keeping us going. We really, really do appreciate the support. Thank you so, so much. And we will see you in the next guide.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.